For today's episode, we have gotten our hands on the all-new Nissan Rogue Sport. Now, if you're watching this video in another country, you might be thinking to yourself that this isn't really all new. That's because Nissan is finally selling the Qashqai in America, only in this country, they're calling it the Rogue Sport. The Rogue and the Rogue Sport are very close cousins. The difference, of course, is that this is a smaller, less expensive vehicle with a less powerful engine under the hood, and this is designed to compete with the likes of the Honda HR-V, the Toyota CHR, and of course the all-new Jeep Compass. One of the most important things to know about the Rogue Sport is that this is not necessarily sportier than the regular Rogue. For some reason in the automotive industry, some manufacturers use the term sport to indicate the slightly smaller version of something. For instance, the Hyundai Santa Fe versus the Hyundai Santa Fe Sport. The Hyundai Santa Fe Sport is the smaller version of the Santa Fe, just like this is a smaller Nissan Rogue. Up front, there's definitely a family resemblance with the rest of the Nissan crossover lineup. We have this V-shaped chrome section right here in the front grille. We have some chevron-shaped accent strips inside the headlamp modules. These are halogen projector headlamps on our model. And of course, lower on the front bumper, we also have fog lamps. The model that we're testing today is the mid-level trim SV. When you first look at the Rogue Sport, it might be easy to assume that this is more of a CR-V or RAV4 competitor because this is notably wider than something like the HR-V or the CHR or of course the Mazda 3. The Rogue Sport is about 3 to 4 inches wider than the average subcompact in America, and that helps give it a slightly roomier cabin inside. The biggest difference between the Rogue and the Rogue Sport is, of course, the length of the vehicle. This is 172 inches long, which is 13 inches shorter than a Nissan Rogue. The overall length of the Rogue Sport means that this slots somewhere between categories, much like the Jeep Compass. This is longer than something like an HR-V, but notably shorter than something like the Nissan Rogue. The sort of tweener status makes sense in the Nissan lineup because, of course, Nissan also offers the Nissan Juke, which is considerably shorter than this, and then they have the Nissan Rogue, which is available as either a 2 or a 3-row crossover, and then if you need more room, they have the Pathfinder, which is considerably longer than this. Despite the dimensions of the Rogue Sport, this is targeted again at the HR-V, the CHR, the Jeep Compass, the Mazda CX-3, etc. That's not just because this is notably smaller than the Nissan Rogue, but also because of the overall price tag that we find in the Rogue Sport. The tail lamp modules wrap from the body of the vehicle on over to the liftgate lid, and you'll notice we have that same chevron theme that we saw up front. The turn signal is on the other side, so you can see what that looks like. It is a red turn signal in all Rogue Sport models. And of course, we have SV all-wheel drive badging over here because we are driving the all-wheel drive mid-level trim. There's a single exhaust tip over there on the driver's side, just under the bumper. Instead of using the same engine as the larger Rogue, Nissan decided to use one of their more modern 2-liter 4-cylinder direct injection engines under this hood. This engine produces 141 horsepower and 147 pound-feet of torque. That's a notable reduction over the larger Rogue, although this vehicle is smaller and lighter, and this engine is actually smoother than the engine we find in the larger Rogue as well. As with most of Nissan's vehicles in America, this engine is mated only to a continuously variable transmission. You have the choice of front-wheel drive or all-wheel drive, and if you choose front-wheel drive, as most people in America are likely to, you'll get 25 miles per gallon in the city, 32 on the highway, and a combined score that's actually 1 mile per gallon lower than the larger Rogue. Nissan has not really explained why the fuel economy in this smaller vehicle with a smaller engine is a little bit lower than the Nissan Rogue. Some people have posited that this engine has to work harder for this vehicle, but that's not necessarily true. Again, this vehicle is actually smaller and lighter, so in relative terms, this engine is working just about as hard as the larger engine. Personally, I think the big difference really just lies in the way that EPA fuel economy scores are calculated, and in truth, this vehicle gets nearly identical fuel economy to the larger Rogue. For a subcompact crossover, these seats are very comfortable, so I'm going to give these 9 out of 10 points. These are very thickly padded. Since we're in the SV trim, we have a multi-way power driver's seat with a 2-way adjustable lumbar support, and of course, we have a tilt telescopic steering column. One thing worth noting is that the seats in this vehicle are a little bit wider, and the overall vehicle itself is wider than something like the Chevy Trax. And that means that if you're a larger person, this interior is going to be more comfortable if you're a driver or if you're sitting in the front passenger seat. Rear seat comfort is also quite good for a subcompact crossover. This front seat is all the way back in its tracks. My knees are not touching the seat back, although I only have about ½ an inch left. If I move over to the left side of the car, where this front seat was adjusted for me at 6 feet tall driving, I still have about 2 inches of legroom left. In addition to a good amount of legroom, we also have very generous headroom. I have about 1 inch left sitting very upright in this back seat. And a lot of subcompact crossovers have very tight back seats, most notably something like the Mazda CX-3. When comparing vehicles, it's important to sit in the front seat, adjust it for you, and then sit right here behind yourself and see how much relative room you have in vehicles that you're looking at. If you were to rely just on published dimensions, you would assume that the Honda HR-V's rear seats are more accommodating than what we find in the Rogue Sport, but that's not the case. Real-world legroom figures are actually a little bit closer than you might think. We may get a little bit more legroom in the HR-V, but this rear seat is more accommodating than the HR-V, it's more comfortable, and these seats are wider. And that means that if you needed to put an adult right here in the middle seat, it's going to be much more comfortable in this vehicle than in the Honda HR-V. The HR-V is very well packaged, but in terms of overall legroom, the way that those measurements are taken makes it appear to be roomier than it actually is. Rear seat passengers get a softly padded center armrest with 2 cup holders. That's a nice touch that we don't find in every subcompact crossover, and even rarer, the rear passengers actually get air vents as well. Depending on the model that you get, cargo capacity varies between 22.9 cubic feet and 19.9 cubic feet. That puts this vehicle above the average in this segment, but below something like the HR-V or the Jeep Compass. Cargo capacity and cargo practicality is obviously a priority at Nissan. That's something that we see in all of their vehicles, the Rogue Sport included. The cargo area is deep enough that you can put 22-inch roller bags right like that and still have the tonneau cover, if I unlatch that, go flat right there under those bags. As we see in Nissan's larger crossover, we have some additional storage area right there under the load floor. This is a little bit different than we see in the Rogue because these can't be put at different levels back here, but you can see that we can use this one to divide the cargo area to keep items from sliding forward and backward, and we can still put things like a 22-inch roller bag in that area. These cargo dividers can also be relocated to the bottom of the load floor, helping give you a little bit more cargo room right there. If we move those pieces out of the way and then completely lift up the load floor, we find a spare tire under here. This is also where you find the jack and, of course, the tire iron. As we take a look around the interior, keep in mind that we are in the SV trim, which again is more of a mid-level trim. We have height adjustable seatbelts for the driver and front passenger, and our model has cloth seats. The front seats are not as aggressively bolstered as some of the entries in this segment, making it easier for larger people to sit up front. These seats are heated even though they are cloth. The front doors are made from a combination of hard and soft touch plastics. We have a soft touch upper section there, a very soft touch and thickly padded armrest in the middle, and then the rest of the door is made from hard plastic, including this door handle right here, and of course the storage area and the speaker grille lower. The overall dashboard styling is very much like the larger Nissan Rogue. We have large central air vents right over here, a soft touch upper section of the dashboard, and then hard touch plastics lower on the dashboard, including this section right over here on the passenger side. The glove compartment is a large bin-style compartment. I was very easily able to stick a large tablet computer inside. Beneath the 2 large air vents, we find the engine start-stop button over here on the left and one of 2 different infotainment systems in the center console. There's either a 5-inch system or a 7-inch system, and neither system supports Apple CarPlay or Android Auto. The model we're looking at has built-in factory navigation. We also have a built-in 360-degree camera system. Right now we're looking at the front camera right there. We also have the all-around view over here. And then there are some data-connected apps integrated in the system as well, available via this apps button right over here. This is where you'll find things like Sirius XM Traffic, the Travel Link, and of course Facebook and Google Online Search. The model we're driving has dual-zone climate control. Below that we find a USB input, auxiliary input, 12-volt power port, and a small storage cubby. Behind that we find a pretty traditional console shifter. Drive is all the way to the back, manual mode over to the left. We push away from the driver for gear up, pull towards the driver for gear down. Between the front seats, we find 2 large cup holders, the heated seat controls, a small storage area where you can put keys or your smartphone, and then we have a softly padded center armrest that opens to reveal a moderately sized storage cubby where you can very easily put wallets, keys, that sort of thing in there. On the driver's side, we find one of Nissan's typical instrument clusters with black faces, white numbers, and of course a white needle as well. The 2 large dials contain the speedometer, tachometer, engine temperature, and of course fuel level. Between them, we find a color multifunction display. In addition to our typical trip computer readouts, this is where we find things like navigation turn-by-turn directions, the status of the vehicle's active safety systems, where the all-wheel drive system is sending its power, and of course access to certain vehicle settings. Moving out from there, we find one of Nissan's best steering wheels. It's a flat-bottom 3-spoke design with sport grips up top. On the left side of the steering wheel, we find volume up-down, track forward-backward, and then a joystick-style button arrangement that controls the multifunction LCD between the speedometer and the tachometer. On the right side of the wheel, we find phone and voice command buttons, and then we find the controls for either the cruise control or the radar adaptive cruise control system if you opt for that model. If you were hoping for a fast 0 to 60 time out of the Rogue Sport, you might be a little bit disappointed. We clocked 0 to 60 in 9.5 seconds in the model that we're driving here. This is the all-wheel drive version, so it's going to be a little bit slower than the front-wheel drive version because traction is not necessarily an issue in this vehicle, and the all-wheel drive system adds extra weight, therefore making this just a little bit slower to 60 than the front-wheel drive version. 9.5 seconds 0 to 60 is obviously slow in general terms, but for the subcompact crossover segment, this is actually pretty average because you will find exactly the same 0 to 60 time in something like the CHR, the Honda HR-V, the Chevy Trax, or even the Jeep Compass. The Mazda CX-3 is a little bit faster at 8.3 seconds, but if you want acceleration more like your average mid-size family sedan, then you're going to have to step up to something like a Buick Encore with the optional turbocharged engine that will get you down into the 7-second range. As I said before, I think it's a little bit funny that Nissan is calling this the Rogue Sport. I think that they could have found a slightly better name for it, or just borrowed the Qashqai name from Europe. On the flip side of things, this does feel more nimble out on the road than the larger Rogue, but not as nimble as something like the Nissan Juke. In our braking test, we ran from 60 miles an hour back to 0 in 124 feet, which is basically the same as the larger Rogue. Keep in mind, of course, we are driving the mid-level trim of the Rogue Sport. If you get the top-end trim, we get wider tires, and that will reduce your 60 to 0 braking distance. In terms of overall handling, the Rogue Sport does fairly well for itself. Body roll is very well controlled, even though the suspension is on the softer side of this segment. This does not feel quite as engaging as the Mazda CX-3, but it definitely feels better than something like the Honda HR-V. Although the Jeep Compass has fairly wide tires in comparable trims, the curb weight and the overall design of the Compass makes it feel more isolated than we find in the Rogue Sport. It also has a little bit more body roll. It feels less engaging out on the road. Oddly enough, one of the sportiest entries in this subcompact crossover segment is the brand new Toyota CHR, and that's thanks to a fully independent suspension all the way around in that Toyota and very wide tires even in base trims. Now that said, of course, the CHR is not going to get you from 0 to 60 any faster than the Rogue Sport. When it comes to our overall handling score, I'm going to give the Rogue Sport a B, because this does fall below the fun factor that we find in the CX-3, most notably the steering engagement. The steering is pretty numb, although it does get a little bit firmer if you put it in the sport mode. There's still not a lot of feedback coming from the front tires. Overall grip is also a little bit below some of the competition, most notably the CHR and that CX-3, depending on the tires that you get on your Rogue Sport. Cabin noise is very well controlled for a subcompact crossover. This vehicle came in at 71 decibels at 50 miles an hour in our usual test area, which definitely makes this one of the quieter subcompact crossovers. According to the EPA, the Rogue Sport should average 27 miles per gallon. Over a week of mixed driving in this all-wheel drive model, we have been averaging 25.5. That means that in terms of overall fuel economy, this is almost exactly the same as the larger Rogue in our weekly testing. But this is a few miles per gallon below the Honda HR-V, the Toyota CHR, and even the Chevy Trax. The fuel economy score surprised me a little bit, but of course we are driving the all-wheel drive version of the Rogue Sport, and the higher fuel economy that we got in our daily testing in the HR-V, the CHR, and the Trax, those were all in the front-wheel drive model. However, this will still get a few miles per gallon lower than those vehicles if they had all-wheel drive. Part of that seems to be the way that Nissan has programmed this all-wheel drive system. This system always engages from a standstill, whereas a lot of the competition won't engage in this category until there is actual wheel slip. So if you're actually stopped in the Rogue Sport and you press on the accelerator pedal, from 0 to about 5 or 10 miles an hour, it actually tries to lock the center coupling to help keep you from having any slip at all. That means that in adverse weather conditions or on snow or on ice, this is going to feel more sure-footed than some of the competition, and that's likely why the Rogue Sport or Qashqai is quite popular in Canada. The Rogue Sport is a solid little crossover out on the road. Acceleration is acceptable. It comes in pretty average for this particular segment, so is braking. Handling is very good overall, although feel does fall a little bit behind some of the leaders. But this has an excellent ride score and an excellent cabin noise score, probably thanks to its slightly larger size. The Rogue Sport is definitely more comfortable for long highway drives than something like a Chevy Trax or even a Buick Encore. The big difference is what I sometimes call the bobblehead factor. In small vehicles, when going over rough washboard pavement especially, it can feel like the vehicle is rocking back and forth, sort of like a bobblehead, but that's not going on in the Rogue Sport, likely because of the larger dimensions we have in this vehicle and just the overall way the suspension is tuned. Pricing has yet to be announced for 2018, so the pricing that you're seeing on your screen right now is 2017 pricing. Now, I don't expect it to change too much because the Rogue Sport is new in America for 2017. However, because the basics of the vehicle have been around for a little bit longer in other world markets, it wouldn't surprise me too much if Nissan decided to add CarPlay and Android Auto to the 2018 model year, at least in top-end versions, just like we've seen them do with the larger Nissan Rogue for 2018. At $21,420 for the base S trim in front-wheel drive, the Rogue Sport is one of the more expensive base models in the subcompact crossover segment. That is, of course, because, as I said before, Nissan is attacking this sort of double segment of subcompact crossover and compact crossover with 3 crossovers, not just 2 crossovers. This is very similar to what we see Jeep doing. The model we were driving this week was, of course, the mid-level SV trim, which is very well priced, at just about $23,000 for the front-wheel drive model, $24,370 for the all-wheel drive model that we were driving. It's worth noting that if you want some of the fancier features advertised in the Rogue Sport, you do have to get the SL trim in order to add them to that vehicle, and then you have to also add the Premium and the Platinum packages to it. That would get you the autonomous braking system, the radar adaptive cruise control, LED headlamps, etc. Now let's move over to the key takeaways. Obviously, the relative size of the Rogue Sport could be a pro or a con for you, depending on what size vehicle you're looking for. But it does mean that you're going to get more room on the inside than in most subcompact crossovers, and definitely a more comfortable back seat. As I have said in the past, there is a bit of variation in the way that different manufacturers measure their seat and leg room. And that really does come into play, especially in smaller vehicles like this, because in real-world situations, I found the back seats of the Rogue Sport to be more comfortable than what we see in the Honda HR-V, even though the HR-V on paper appears to have more room. The Rogue Sport is slow in general, but it's not really that much slower than the average entry in this segment, so overall performance is actually fairly good compared to the mainline competition. The biggest takeaways, of course, for the Rogue Sport are that it's very easy to live with. It's comfortable, it's roomy on the inside, it has a decent cargo area in the back, it has a back seat that is very, very practical for the average family as well. You really won't find that much less room in the back seat of the Rogue Sport than something like a Toyota RAV4. But of course, as I said at the beginning, this is not a RAV4 or CR-V competitor. It is a more direct competitor to something like the Honda HR-V. Let's start there with our competition. The HR-V starts at $19,570, which is less than the Rogue Sport. Obviously, it is also a little bit smaller, but a lot of the difference actually ends up in the fact that the HR-V comes standard with a manual transmission, not an automatic like we find in the Rogue Sport. Once you've added the automatic transmission to the HR-V, the delta shrinks to about $1,000, and much of that can be explained away by the standard feature content that we find in the Nissan versus what we see in the HR-V. That said, of course, the HR-V will still be a little bit less expensive than the Nissan Rogue. However, you should expect to see a greater discount over MSRP at the Nissan dealer than what we see at the Honda dealer. That seems to be fairly typical. The HR-V is one of the best-selling subcompact crossovers in America because it is very, very practical. Honda was able to borrow a lot of the best features from their small fit subcompact hatchback and jam them into the HR-V. That includes the magic seats in the back, which not only flip and fold, but the seat bottom cushion folds up so you can put large bulky items right there in that rear passenger compartment. And of course, we have a very large cargo area in the HR-V. But on the downside, the HR-V is not as much fun to drive as something like a CX-3, and it ultimately ends up being a little bit less comfortable for people than the Nissan Rogue Sport. We also don't find as many premium features available in the HR-V for some reason in America, including Honda's sensing system, which they do include on a wide variety of other vehicles, including the subcompact Fit, but we don't see for 2018 in the HR-V. Next up, we have the Chevy Trax, which starts at $21,000. It has a 1.4-liter turbocharged 4-cylinder engine standard, although it doesn't actually produce that much more power than we see in the average entry in this segment. And that's why the 0 to 60 time is basically the same as the Rogue Sport. The interior in the Trax is plain but well put together, and they've definitely upgraded it in its latest refresh versus when the Trax originally launched in America. The first generation Chevy Trax in the US I thought was just a little bit too cheap inside, but they really have improved the interior quality. Value is definitely strong in the base models of the Trax. We get a standard 7-inch infotainment system with Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, and we have a fold-flat front passenger seat, which makes putting large and bulky items into the Trax much easier than a large number of the competition. In terms of overall handling, it's quite comparable to the Rogue Sport, but fuel economy is definitely better than what we find in the Nissan. On the downside, the Chevy lags behind the Nissan when it comes to cabin noise as well as overall ride refinement. The Trax definitely has that same kind of bobblehead feel that I've mentioned in other subcompact vehicles before. That's likely because of the overall size and the overall suspension tuning that we find in the Chevy. Next up, we have the Mazda CX-3, easily one of my favorites in the subcompact crossover segment. Although it's still not fast in general terms, the CX-3 is one of the faster subcompact crossovers in America, and that's true even if you expand it out to more premium offerings like the Buick Encore. The CX-3 is fun to drive, it's attractive inside and out. We have Mazda's latest infotainment and navigation system available in the CX-3, which they are promising to add Apple CarPlay and Android Auto to very soon, and it's a very well put vehicle altogether. Not only is the CX-3 faster than the average entry in the segment, it's also just more fun to drive all the way around. We also find a few more premium touches available inside the cabin at a very reasonable price in the CX-3, and fuel economy is quite good as well. On the downside, it's just not as practical as something like the HR-V or the Rogue Sport. It also doesn't have a back seat that is as comfortable. The cargo area in the CX-3 especially is fairly small because of the overall design and overall shape of the vehicle. But that said, it is a well-priced subcompact crossover starting at $20,110, and on up the line it's going to be a little bit less expensive than the MSRP that we see in the Rogue. Now we must move on to the other tweener entry, the all-new Jeep Compass. It's logical that because both models are trying to straddle the subcompact and compact segments, we see a very similar starting price in the Compass. But that low starting price can be a little deceiving with Jeep models because $20,995 gets you the base trim front-wheel drive with a manual transmission. If you want to get the automatic transmission, that'll actually set you back $22,495. Although the availability of a manual transmission may be attractive to some shoppers, most buyers really are looking for an automatic transmission, and that will mean that a comparable base model will be more expensive. In kind of an odd twist, Jeep uses two different automatic transmissions in the Compass. The front-wheel drive models use a 6-speed Aisin automatic transmission, whereas the all-wheel drive models use a 9-speed transmission made by ZF of Germany. The 9-speed automatic transmission, which is also used in a number of Honda, Acura, and Land Rover products, has been the cause of some customer complaints because of the way that the transmission shifts. There's nothing wrong per se with that transmission, it's just that it shifts differently than standard automatics, and you will definitely notice the difference if you drive a front-wheel drive Compass and an all-wheel drive Compass back to back. But that 9-speed automatic transmission does allow the all-wheel drive Compass to get exactly the same EPA combined score as the front-wheel drive Compass, and that's why Chrysler uses it. Fuel economy and handling both suffer in the Compass because of Jeep's off-road mission. We get more off-road ability, more ground clearance, better approach, departure, and breakover angles in the Compass, and we also have one of the most capable all-wheel drive systems you can buy in either a subcompact or a compact crossover. But that does have a penalty, and that penalty is added weight, and the added weight means that we have longer braking distances, poorer handling, and lower fuel economy in general terms. As we see in the rest of the Jeep lineup, one of the big selling points for the Compass is that you can buy a Jeep in this small form factor, but you can still add all of the gadgets and luxury options that you might want and might be looking at in the larger Jeep Cherokee. Things like Jeep's large infotainment system, the 7-inch LCD instrument cluster, and more premium interior finishings are available in the Compass if you're willing to pay for them. Now let's talk about my top picks. It's hard to go wrong with the Nissan Rogue, but my top pick does still have to be the Mazda CX-3. I personally don't need the room in the back of the CX-3, and it's just so much more fun than the average entry in this segment, and I really like the way the CX-3 looks, and therefore I'm willing to give it a bit of a pass on its small cargo area. Now the Rogue Sport is definitely more comfortable and more practical, but it's just not quite as exciting as the CX-3. If you're looking for the best all-around subcompact crossover, then the Rogue Sport definitely fits that bill, and I would say it comes in a close number 2. If, however, you're looking for a very well-rounded crossover, then definitely put the Rogue Sport on your shopping list. I think the Rogue Sport and the Honda HR-V almost tied for number 2 in this segment, but I do have to give the win to the Rogue Sport because of its overall fresher design and the fact that the interior was a little bit more comfortable than the HR-V. One of the best arguments for the Rogue Sport is the customer that's looking for something like a RAV4 or a CR-V or a Rogue, but wants something just a little bit smaller. Maybe it's because you need to be able to fit it in your garage, maybe it's because you have a very short driveway. Whatever the reason is, the Rogue Sport is a good vehicle when you look at it this way, because we still get compact crossover-like features, the comfortable and large back seat, the ability to put child seats across the back with a little bit more room, and rear seat air vents that we don't necessarily see in the average subcompact crossover. And that's why the Rogue Sport is my number 2 pick in this segment, and probably my overall practical pick as well. I will say, however, that if you're starting to take a look at top-end trims of the Rogue Sport, and you don't need quite all that much room in the back seat, then definitely put the Buick Encore on your shopping list. Thanks for taking the time to check out this video. Be sure and find us over at Facebook, at Twitter, at Instagram, and of course you can also head over to patreon.com if you want to support this channel. I'll see you next week.